Dr. Fawcett.
Thank you, Scott, and hello, everybody. I couldn't be here last week. I know Karen stood in. I heard it was good, so I'm really happy about that. I'm glad to be back. I'm in a sweater because I'm in Chicago and freezing, but here I am. It's December. Thanksgiving is behind us, but ahead of us is a tricky time for a lot of addicts and partners of addicts, and that's the holidays. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I guess, what we would call the holiday blues. That's not an official diagnosis, but I think it's something that most people can identify with, and especially anybody with addiction in their lives, whether they're active in addiction or partners of an addict. It can be a stressful time of year. So I just kind of wanted to talk about the signs and symptoms of it, what some of the causes are, and maybe some of the things we can do about it, just real briefly, because I think no matter how hard we try, it affects us, and just it's in the air. So wanted to talk about that a little bit. First, to correct one kind of misperception. A lot of people think the holidays are the time of the highest suicide, which is not. Actually, suicides drop this time of year, which is maybe a weird thing, although a lot of depression and acting out and other kinds of things do definitely escalate. So what are the signs? Probably the biggest one people have, and it's characterized by that word blues or blahs, is depression. There's a lot of depressive symptoms, and these are distinct from people that might have depression otherwise. That often gets worse during the holidays for them. But for people that aren't normally depressed, the holidays can often create a sense of depression and kind of this feeling of blah, just kind of being overloaded and not too excited about anything. Some other symptoms we see: exhaustion. I think people just run around too hard, they overcommit, they do things, they overeat. If they're in their addiction and drinkers, they may drink, they may party too hard, and so on. We see indecisiveness as people get stressed. They kind of can't decide what to do, or they have trouble making major decisions. We see what we would call anhedonia, which is an inability to experience pleasure. People just get kind of overloaded, so nothing seems to be pleasurable in the season. In fact, people often get irritable, and kind of the opposite. They get irritable and cranky and don't enjoy things and probably aren't very much fun to be around themselves. And then finally, I think that the other big symptom we see is loneliness. And that this is a time of year when we have kind of an idea based on advertising and media and movies about how cheery and happy the holiday season should be. And for a lot of people, it's just not. You know, our families don't look like that. We're in a lot of pain right now emotionally. We may have we have lost someone. So it just oftentimes, or we're alienated from families. There's a lot of reasons why it's just not as perfect as a Christmas card might indicate. And I think that can cause a lot of stress for people. It's a time of year when things aren't well in our families, it's really obvious. Other times we can kind of avoid it, ignore it, but this is the time of year when families are supposed to come together and function, and sometimes it's not. Why? Why do we have the holiday blues? I think probably the single biggest thing is stress. Stress from the pressure of doing things, being places, taking care of people, getting everything done. So there's a lot of stress just built in to the holidays themselves. Sometimes we overspend. So I think sometimes there's a lot of financial stress. People feel obliged to spend too much money on gifts for people, and so there's a lot of financial complications that can happen. There's isolation, there's addiction. I think it's a classic time where people do start to act out more, whether it's drinking or drugging or sex addiction, because as we know on this webinar, the more stress people are experiencing, the more people act out. And so I think a lot of times people cope with some of the problems of the holidays by acting out. And the other thing is, I think as the new year approaches, it's the end of a year. I think it's kind of a setup sometimes for feeling disappointed, for not being where you want to be, where we thought we would be, at this kind of rolling over, kind of fresh beginning of January 1st. We naturally kind of go back and appraise and look at things. And I think it could be hard for people because they may not be in the place they want to be, or they may not have succeeded where they wanted to succeed. So those are all kind of setups for the new year. So what can we do about that for this holiday blues? First of all, for people on this website, to really avoid addictive behaviors. I think to anytime we add alcohol or drugs or sexual acting out or acting out with porn to stress, into stressful times and stressful families in high pressure situations, it's not a good outcome. It's a bad thing. So I think just avoiding acting out behaviors is certainly important. If you're not an addict, I think people tend to overdrink. We have people that just drink too much or drug too much or act out too much, even though they may not consider themselves addicts. So to really kind of be, to exercise moderation in what we do, I think is really important, including spending, by the way. I think a lot of people just feel that more purchases are going to make them feel better, make their families happy. And so that kind of stress, I think, is really problematic. Number two, I would say not to isolate. Isolation, I mentioned loneliness is a big factor of the holiday blues. We know, we harp on this every week here, connection is really a really strong protective factor. It really contributes to an individual sense of resilience. So I think really staying connected to people, and that may not be, putting up, if there's a lot of conflict with your family of origin, I would go to your family of choice, but I would hang out with people who give you support and give you positive feedback and with whom you feel comfortable, as opposed to kind of demanding that you go and be uncomfortable in a place where you may not feel welcome or you may feel judged or with a lot of stress. So not isolating, but choosing very carefully who you do tend to connect with. Another thing that people can do that I found is really helpful is just exercise. We know that exercise is a great way to regulate emotional moods and stress relief. And oftentimes when you're dragging to feel totally exhausted, if you work out, you actually have more energy when you're done. So I think it's a great way to just burn off stress, to distract yourself, and to really kind of do something nice for yourself as well. And along with that other aspect of self-care, adequate sleep, eating well, not overeating, all this stuff that we know, but that we tend to ditch during the holidays. So I think it's important to really take care of yourself at that time of year. A couple others. One is to manage expectations. I think sometimes, as I said, we have this kind of hallmark idea of what our holiday celebration should look like, and oftentimes our lives don't reflect that. And so I think we have to manage how we spend our time, where we go, who we do that with, in order to not set ourselves up for a real fall of disappointment or resentments or anger, and kind of setting ourselves up. I think we all know instinctively what situations may be problematic. I know the first couple of years in recovery, I stayed away from my family just because I didn't feel I was had the emotional resilience to deal with it. Later, things got better, but I think I really had to take care of myself, and I felt a lot of guilt about that. I had a lot of pressure about not coming home, but it was really important for me to do. So I think to really take care of yourself and manage those expectations is really important. And finally, maybe the biggest thing is to really set limits. And by that I mean set limits on what you're doing, on your obligations. Learn to say no. We can't go to 18,000 parties. We can't make fabulous meals every day of the week. We can't buy gifts for everybody on the block. We have to really be realistic about the levels of our energy and time and emotional resilience and even our finances. So this is a season when we're pushed by a lot of social pressure to really overdo it. And I think it's really up to us to have those boundaries. If you're in sex addiction recovery, that would be something in your outer circle, outer boundary, to really take care of yourself with rest and adequate food and staying connected and setting limits on the expectations you have for yourself and just not overdoing it. I think that's one of the biggest things we see relapse-wise. And relapses tend to happen, people kind of white knuckle often through the holidays, but they relapse right after the first of the year. And I think a lot of that is the stress of just kind of overdoing it during the holidays and really setting themselves up for all these factors that we go to our natural medication, right, which is our sexual acting out or our addictions and any kind of acting out. So it's really important just to be kind to ourselves and not overdo it, and just be as gentle with ourselves as we can. So to sum what to do, avoid the addictive behaviors. Even if you don't consider yourself an addict, really be cautious about overdoing it, because it's a time of year when it's socially sanctioned and we can all get in trouble. Don't isolate, but choose carefully who you tend to connect with, because we can kind of get in trouble with that. Self-care, exercise, sleep, eating moderately, staying well hydrated, all that stuff that we know and often forget. Setting limits on social obligations, financial obligations, all that. Just taking care of yourself, saying no. And finally, managing those expectations, which is really, I think, about the setting limits. So that's my quick review of holiday blues, and I wish everybody a lot of resilience and strength getting through it. I think a lot of that's expectation. If we take care of ourselves starting now, we'll be fine. But it's always useful, I think, to point that out this time of year.
Thank you, David. For those of you who joined us late, our topic is holiday blues, obviously, and how to get through them in a sane and sober way. And if you want to ask questions, doesn't have to be about holiday blues. You can ask them about anything. Please use the Q&A feature, and David will be happy to answer them. I kind of wanted to get us a little bit started. You know, you say Christmas, I picture Norman Rockwell. You know, It's a Wonderful Life minus all the drama. It's supposed to be perfect. And you talked about managing expectations. And, when I was a little kid, it was, woke up in the morning and there were presents everywhere and there were cookies and hot chocolate and it was perfect. But as an adult, just a lot of hard work and a lot of money and a lot of time and, that goes into that. For people who have this need to be perfect for others in their life, for the holidays, to make the perfect, if I need to make the perfect holiday for you, David, how do I manage expectations there? What if you're not receptive or don't like the gift? How do I deal with that? How do people manage that?
I think we really have to be cautious about our people-pleasing tendencies too. I think there's a lot of, you really put an example of where there's a lot of emotional turmoil this time of year, because we're trying to do the right thing. We're trying to keep people happy, and sometimes it's just not possible, I think. And so I think these are hard choices. I think a lot of prodependent or codependent behavior and tools might be really useful here in terms of just setting boundaries and taking care of ourselves and really not feeling the need to please everybody. I mean, when I had to not go home, I felt a lot of pressure. I felt really guilty and all kinds of really terrible, distressing feelings, because I was like torn. It was like something, it's like I was being unfaithful to my family somehow, even though I knew it was not going to be good for me. But I think we just have to kind of make the best choices we can. It's not always going to be happy or easy, but yeah, I think just to kind of do what's in our best interest. And as in any situation where I'm kind of confused, where my old feelings kind of kick up and I don't have clarity, I really look for other people to help me out. I actively talk to people about explaining situations and get their feedback on what to do, because I mentioned one of those symptoms of holiday blues is indecisiveness. I think sometimes we get caught up in these mixed, the pull and the push and mixed interests, our own and somebody else's, and sometimes we just don't know what to do, and that can be very stressful. So I often rely on my friends or trusted advisors to give me that clarity.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I've had to deal with over the years is I do not go home for the holidays. I have a Zoom call with my family on Christmas Eve when they're all there, and then I usually call on the phone, on Christmas Day, and that is more than enough for me. And what they've learned, I think, is that's enough for them too. We do well in the same room for short periods of time, but not for long periods.
Yeah.
But in the beginning, there were expectations that why am I not coming out? What's wrong with me? Like my mother is thinking, what's wrong with me that my son doesn't want to come home for the holidays? And I just had to deal with that. I just had to accept that that's how she was going to react to my self-care.
And Scott, what did you do with the feelings of guilt or whatever emotions you had in that situation? How did you manage those?
I'm sort of the opposite of codependent. We don't even like that word at Seeking Integrity, but I'm very self-centered. I really am, and I tend to put myself first. Okay. For me, and particularly early in my recovery, I was not so worried about how my mother felt. I was worried about how I would feel after she would get on the phone and harangue me because I wasn't going home because she was having a feeling. Nowadays, I'm much more cognizant of, I'm much more empathetic of other people. But in the beginning, I really had no empathy in my recovery. In any facet of life. I mean, it wasn't just my addiction where I had no empathy for people. It was every part of life. I had sort of lost that ability through my addiction, which I think is fairly common.
I agree, totally.
So, everybody, please ask us questions by the Q&A feature. This webinar is for you, not for David and I. We're here to help you. So please ask us some questions. I did want to talk a little bit about, we have the guys from our Seeking Integrity Treatment Center on the webinar tonight. Here they are in really early recovery. Probably most of the guys over here today are going to be home by Christmas. Some of them may still be at the center through Christmas. How does somebody like that go home into this painfully emotionally charged atmosphere? I mean, it's the worst possible time to go home. I mean, it's the best possible time to go home because it's Christmas, but it's also the worst possible time because family dysfunction is just on steroids at the holidays.
Right.
Do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mentioned several times connection. I think really to have a strong source of support outside the family, whether it's recovery group, support group, whatever that would be, where certainly I in early recovery needed to get out of the stressful environments to a safe place. And those safe places were my recovery groups. Now the guys may not have those well established yet, but I think to do the best they can with that. The other thing I think is to set really clear boundaries with the family. And it may be, we have a policy when our clients get on the phone, news, sports, weather, which may or may not be successful in sticking to that. But I think going home in this time of year, I think it's really important to kind of not get into heavy duty discussions and try to keep it light, as hard as that may be, but to really set clear boundaries and just kind of have a truce on heavy topics to get through the holidays, because oftentimes there's kids, there's other families around, there's other people that are involved. And I think, especially if there's issues in the marriage, those aren't really best dealt with at the holiday table. So I think to really have some clear boundaries about when and where and what is talked about, with the understanding that stuff is not being, buried. It's going to be dealt with, adequately and competently, but after the holidays, if that's possible. I think to get into it too soon, because just as you said, Scott, it's not even really the specific issues of any one marriage or addiction, but it's just it's in the ether. It's stressful. It's a stressful time of year, and just being together is stressful. So I would recommend staying connected with a recovery group, with a resource group, and really trying to set boundaries within the home about what's talked about, what's not, and this kind of no-go zones where we just don't get into it. It's almost like when you have, in our charged and very divided political atmosphere, I know around Thanksgiving there was a lot of articles about, what to do, and mostly that involved just avoiding certain topics and just not going there. And I think that probably is a good strategy in the short term for that situation.
Yeah, I was just about to ask about that. I mean, forget sex addiction for a minute. You're at the holidays and you've got one opinion on one side of the table and another opinion on the other side of the table. How do you set a boundary with people? Can we not talk politics today? How do you broach that topic And then what if somebody doesn't respect the boundary? How do you handle that?
Oh, you're asking tough questions. I think this year I heard about a number of people hosting dinners actually stating that up front. I mean, it was that explicit, just like, you're welcome, but these are the things we're not going to talk about. And so I think most times people respect that if it happens. And if you get somebody who's, drinking or whatever and may get loud or opinionated, I think to really kind of de-escalate as quickly as you can, and maybe, ask the person to vacate or leave or get some space, because that addicts are great reactors, right? All people are, but in this time of year when we're under stress, most often we react almost instinctively. And I think if you get into a charged atmosphere where someone's saying something you find offensive or hurtful, or you perceive as being shaming, or, we react rather than think. And I think this time of year, it's important to kind of just use as many strategies as we can to keep those little hot spots from erupting at the dinner table. And that may mean just kind of saying, we're not going to talk about this right up front. Or it may mean not going to that dinner. I think those are hard choices people have to make too. Just finding a safe place to celebrate. And that may be what people need to do.
Yeah, it's please ask us some questions. Nobody's asking questions tonight. Come on.
Maybe a loser of a topic.
It's timely, but you can ask questions about anything.
Right.
If you're new to recovery, or if you've been in recovery and you have a question, whatever, any topic is good. I have a sponsee who is a recovering sex addict. He's also a recovering alcoholic. He's got a lot of time from alcohol and about 6 months, 7 months from sex addiction, but he found out his wife, who supposedly had also a lot of time from alcoholism, had been drinking for the past year. So she went into treatment now that he's out of treatment. And she has some secondary issues that need to be dealt with. So she's leaving 60 days in substance abuse treatment and going to a more than sober living, less than treatment, less than a rehab, for probably 60 to 90 days to stabilize and its physical health issues, physical pain, and to get properly medicated. And, there's good reasons to go, and they're lucky enough they have the money to pay for all that. But there was a 4-day period over the weekend where between treatment and going into this facility. So of course she came home, and he's like, "What do I do? What do we talk about? All of this stuff. Do we get to have sex? And my response to him was, try to keep it light. And no, you don't get to have sex. This is just not a good time." And he agreed with that, but and he was lucky enough that because she was still in treatment and they were planning her exit, with a family counselor, they were able to agree that we were going to keep it light. And then she got home and she wanted to get into some of the deeper stuff, and he stuck to his guns, and she got really mad. But then the next day she apologized and remembered the boundary, and it was interesting, but he was glad that this is the point of this story. He was really glad he stuck to the boundary. But he said it was one of the hardest things he's ever had to do, because he doesn't feel like because he just cheated on her, and he's in treatment, and he doesn't feel like he deserves to have a boundary that's healthy for him. He should be there, and do what she wants. It was and he called me. He said, "What do I do?" I'm like, "Stick to your boundary." So I loved your advice from earlier about setting some boundaries, and but I think that it's very hard to bring it up in the first place, if it's not set beforehand. I love the idea of, hosting a dinner party, no politics. I'm having people over for New Year's, and I think I'm going to say, and by the way, we will have the football game on. We will not have the news on. Please don't talk about the news.
Right.
Yeah.
One interesting thing I was reminded of as you spoke is that sometimes, especially I think in early recovery, when we're taking care of ourselves, it feels almost self-indulgent that we don't have a right to do that. And I think, and part of that is, we're not often very nice people in our addiction, and we've, taken advantage of people and hurt them in many ways. But I think sometimes in recovery, it is important to be able to take care of ourselves. And by that, I mean, not engaging if need be, setting boundaries, really saying no, whatever the situation may be. And that, at least for me, that felt, I didn't have any kind of natural discernment that helped me know that I had the right to say that. It felt weird, and I was guilty and shamed. And so I think getting advice from people, like a sponsor like you, or someone that can kind of help us with that, that's more objective about the situation, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we really need a support network around us, is to get that feedback. Okay, we've got a couple questions here. I'm 4 months into sex addiction recovery. You've got a 5-year relationship with kids. I'm trying to stay focused, but the ups and downs from her, I assume a wife or girlfriend, is causing me to have more ups and downs. I'm trying hard, working hard almost constantly. I know I'm the cause of this roller coaster. I'm adding that. I will have to take my legs, but at what point do I say something? This is a very common question, holidays or no, for men in sex addiction recovery, it's a wife or a partner who's really up and down with her or his reactions to the addict.
Right. This is very common. I think really it's important. One of the things we stress with people is that both parties have professional support, right? Each has a therapist, each has a recovery support group. So I think people are not trying to fix each other, but they have professional help helping them doing that. I think sometimes there's this mismatch. There's obviously a lot of emotions that are up and down, whether it's dismissiveness, never wanting to see the person again, or being overly involved, or just being angry or being hurt. All those feelings are up and down all over the place. And I think oftentimes the addict wants to get that, kind of move past that as quickly as possible, right? And get that behind them. But there's a lot of healing that has to take place. And what we find is that the rates of healing differ between the two parties very, very drastically. It takes longer, I think, for a partner to regain the trust, to be able to be vulnerable, to be able to talk to the person without getting angry again. So it's a problem. And I think it's something that has to be gauged in terms of how much you interact and engage with each other. And I think that's where that professional help I mentioned, both people can really help. There's some really great communication skills that a therapist can go over with you. Thinking of the Imago dialogue for one, that really kind of slows some of these interactions down. It clarifies it. One partner has to repeat what the other said to make sure they were heard correctly, and that kind of thing. That can really sort of at least establish connection. Because sometimes in the situation you're talking about, people are talking past each other, people are reactive, and there's just a lot of stirring up of difficult emotions. But I think for the addict who's feeling guilty, feeling some shame, feeling responsibility, it feels hard to kind of put a boundary out there. But I think it is important to at least not get into this stuff too soon, because I think this stuff has to unfold carefully with support as people are ready to talk with it. So I guess in a word, boundaries, and get support and judgment in terms of how to engage, what to talk about. I've had couples that just really didn't, certain topics were off limits until they both had worked through them individually, and then they could come together and talk about them as a couple. So it's a process. And I think one of our slogans at Seeking Integrity is trust the process. And it really does. If you're engaged, I think, in therapy, both of you, and if you have goodwill and that connection, I think it'll happen. But it's not always in the timetable that we want. And with kids, as you say, in your situation and all that, you have a lot to work for. And so I think I would just be patient but not avoid, but actively kind of work on these issues and with some professional help, talk about when to come together and deal with them.
Yeah, I agree with that. kudos for understanding that your behavior caused a lot of the relationship strife. It probably didn't cause all of it, but it probably caused the bulk of it right now. And the stuff that you and your partner are dealing with right now is probably related more to your sex addiction than any other factor in the relationship. So great for taking responsibility for that. And you seem to understand that you have caused some trauma for your partner, and that she or he is struggling with that. And, trauma is, we get crazy when we're traumatized. If I find out my child has cancer, I am going to harangue and harass the poor doctor, and he's going to answer my questions, and I'm not going to hear the answer, so I'm going to ask the question again, and because I'm in crisis and I'm spinning. And one minute I'm going to love my doctor, and the next minute I'm going to hate my doctor because he's not listening, or because he's gotten a little frustrated with me. And that's what your partner is going through, because your partner's traumatized, and it takes time. 6 months, a year, 18 months, it depends. The best thing you can do is be rigorously honest in every facet of your life, so that your partner sees, I am really working on this. I am telling you the truth. I'm not lying anymore. Any little lie that you spit out there is going to it's going to back the process up like 2 weeks, for just a little white lie. More. Just don't lie. And be patient, and it will slowly get better. And one day you'll wake up and realize, oh, she or he trusts me again, or hasn't questioned me in weeks. Isn't that nice? But it's going to be a while. There's no set time frame. So
yeah. But keep up what you're doing with the trying hard and working at it, because that's what it takes.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the solution.
A couple more questions here. This one I'm just going to have to completely throw it to you, David. Can you talk a little bit about projective identification in addiction and how it ties into transference? That's Greek for me.
We're getting to some interesting psychodynamic stuff there. Just real quickly, projective identification is when we see, oftentimes see parts of ourselves we don't like in someone else. We can't see it in ourselves, but we sure see it in someone else. And it's the phenomenon of walking into a room, meeting someone you've never seen before, know very little about, and just really disliking the person, or really liking the person. But this kind of makes no sense because you don't really know them. But I think we sense a lot of these things, and so we start to identify with aspects of themselves that we may not see in ourselves. Transference is really just that ability to be affected and react in ways to that person, in ways that we reacted to someone else in our lives. And so I think addiction is all wrapped up in that. So if I might meet someone that reminds me of my father, and the feelings that I had toward my father will be projected onto that person, this new person. So it gets very complicated. The solution to that, I think, is just awareness, self-awareness, really working on our stuff. All of us have unresolved issues, and we kind of go around projecting those onto other people around us as opposed to really working on ourselves. So that's a really short answer. It's a complicated issue. I'd love to talk about that all evening, but we're not going to tonight. But
another day.
Stuff. Yeah, another day. I'm all about Jungian shadows and all that stuff. It's really interesting to me, but I think people would drop off pretty quickly.
Yeah, some of the terms, I have a law degree on some of the terms. I was just like, really? Can we just not use plain English? But psychology is the same way. Okay, next question here. I'm in the doghouse because I betrayed my spouse. I expect the healing process will take a long time. Nobody's perfect. Everyone can benefit from therapy. My wife is getting therapy because of what I've done. Good for her. How can I gently ask what issues about herself? Oh, this is interesting. How can I gently ask what issues about herself that she is addressing in her therapy?
Well, good for you for acknowledging your role in this thing and then being engaged in the healing process. I guess maybe there's different opinions on this, but I guess my feeling is that you don't have any business asking what she's working on in therapy. That's her business right now. Just as you have issues you can deal with in treatment or in therapy that she may not be privy to necessarily. And so the reason for that is that it takes that kind of safety on both of your parts to heal and to talk about. And remember, the issues where sex addiction is concerned, there's a lot of betrayal, there's trauma, there's a lack of trust, there's a lack of vulnerability. And so to talk about issues that one is working on in therapy requires all those things. And so, I mean, it'd be interesting. I think if there's an issue that she's working on that could somehow benefit you, I trust that'll emerge in your therapeutic work with each other and each other's therapists. But I would say, for the most part, to let that go. I mean, she's on her journey, you're on your journey, and hopefully you'll come together in a healthy way. But I think right now, I don't know what business that is of yours. I would also ask you to kind of consider what's your intention? I mean, why do you need to know that? And to alleviate guilt, or to have a sense of what, I don't know what it would be. But I think for now, I would try to let that go and really focus on you.
Yeah, that
Sure.
last bit that David just said is just screamed out at me. It's like, oh, somebody's still in denial. You know, one way we engage in denial is we blame somebody else for our behavior. And, you know, it sounds like you're still blaming your wife for what you did, and you want to know if she's working on whatever issue it is that you're using to blame her for your addiction. I'm projecting.
There's projective identification there, Scott, all over that.
Right.
I would also say, just for the benefit of the doubt, it may be that I might have realized I've caused so much pain to my partner, and I want to kind of understand what he or she is working on or something. But in any case, it's not my concern right now.
Yeah, and almost assuredly, yeah. First of all, David's right. You got enough on your plate right now dealing with your own issues. Let her deal with whatever she needs to deal with. But probably what she's dealing with is her incredible anger toward you for cheating on her, number one. And number two, she's probably having some post-traumatic stress symptoms. She's depressed and her emotions are all over the place, and she probably can't sleep, and she probably can't stop thinking about what you did, but she's afraid to talk about it, and she's probably dealing with all of that right now. She's not worried about what happened 30 years ago when she was 9 years old. That's probably not what she's dealing with right now. She's dealing with the immediate crisis. That's my guess. Again, I'm guessing, but my experience is betrayed partners need to work through the crisis first, right, before they look at anything.
And remember, the damage is all about trust and vulnerability and being open and really sharing deep feelings. And she's probably not in a place to do that right now. And that's the kind of work she's doing in therapy. So I think it's just not something that you need to worry about right now.
Yeah, David, can you talk a little bit? And by the way, keep asking questions. These are great questions, people. And thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the fact, I lost my train of thought. Oh my God. How in a relationship, when one person has betrayed the other, let's call it sex addictions. That's what we seem to be talking about most of the time. The betrayed partner, the person that she, we'll just call her a she now, would normally turn to for emotional support is the person who just betrayed her. And, it's very hard. And the betraying partner, the person he would normally turn to for emotional support, he just betrayed that person. Suddenly we have two individuals who are normally the go-to person for each other, who cannot be the go-to person for each other. Right. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic and how difficult it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can't underestimate the amount of pain. And Scott, a minute ago, used the word trauma, and I think that's a really accurate description. It's a trauma response that people get as their whole world drops away. And there's cases where, the acting out has been going on for 30 years and they haven't known about it virtually their whole marriage, and suddenly it all bursts out into the open. And that I think having your world kind of shatter like that is traumatic, and depending on one's own coping skills can take a significant amount of time to come back from. And some marriages cannot be repaired, and others can. But I think in that process, where what normally would be the go-to person for the other isn't an option anymore, people are really floundering around sometimes, looking for who to go, who to trust, who they can talk to. And a lot of times, women in particular, I think, will have friends, often maybe more than guys, that they can talk to. They've talked about feelings, but there's often so much shame and upset about this issue. Those avenues are cut off as well. People don't feel comfortable discussing these very personal issues of kind of betrayal and sex and with their girlfriends or their guy friends. So a lot of avenues for communication are shut off. And so I think it's really important. We just talk about connection all the time, that people establish that social support network. One of the beautiful things I see in treatment are these guys that come together for chemsex or for sex addiction or porn addiction, and find they're all in the same situation, and they bond and they can talk. It's a tremendous resource that I think sometimes the spouses don't always have in the equivalent way that somebody in treatment has, because it's a bond, it's a support group, it's a group that's going to be honest with you, and it's an incredible resource. We do have partners workshops where I think that can be established to some extent, but it's up to both parties in that marriage to establish important, trusted sources of support outside their spouse. And we often do that with a therapist, with a support group, with sponsors, whoever it may be. But the purpose of that really is to create a container for healing for both the addict and the spouse, separate containers to have that process go on before they can come together. And in treatment, one of our jobs is to create that safe container where people can talk about this. And spouses need to be able to find a similar place where they can heal and be safe. And that's why it's important not to really break that container. I mean, what's going on in your wife's healing container is really private, and at this point. And so I think it's all about establishing connection. And we often do that. I think it's important to have a professional involved, somebody who understands sex addiction, because a lot of therapists don't. And I think that can be problematic if you get the wrong therapist, but certainly to have a support group and a sponsor, and hopefully some good friends. I think one of the beauties of getting involved in recovery programs is that we see people and we meet people who have the experience we've had and can really help us through that. And so creating that support system is incredibly important. But I think when a couple heals and comes back together, that's really kind of far down the stages of this process. You can't, and I think a lot of couples with goodwill want to kind of help each other heal early on, but I don't really recommend that. I think it really is a separate process until both are ready to come together in a healthy way. Because oftentimes those relationships have a lot of unhealthy dynamics that really need to be corrected, that are kind of co-conspirators with the addiction in the problems.
So what are some things that, because we've had questions from a couple guys who are here who are clearly doing their work and clearly want to heal themselves and their relationships. What are some things they can do to reintroduce slowly emotional intimacy into their relationship to the point where, you know, a year or so, however long down the line, it starts to feel normal again. We trust each other again. We actually become each other's go-to again. What are some concrete steps that can be taken?
I think probably the single biggest one is one of the words in our company name, which is integrity. And I would, by integrity, I mean really just being absolutely consistent with what you say you're going to do and following through on that. I think addicts get kind of sloppy with that sometimes, or be downright deceitful. But I think really establishing a pattern where it creates an environment of trust, where trust can be established again. I think being vulnerable oneself. I think acknowledging in an empathetic way the damage or the harm or the hurt one has caused, really conveying an understanding of that is helpful. But I think overall, I heard this expression today in a workshop I was in, your word is law, meaning just, if you say you're going to do something, you do it. If you're going to be somewhere, you're there. And I think only by that repeated pattern does trust get established. And it's slow, and it's so frustrating, I think, for every addict, because in their heart of hearts, they know they've changed and they're different. And they feel they're different, but the spouse is on a different recovery timetable, and it takes time to reestablish that trust. But I think time, integrity, honesty, conveying empathy, and not sympathy, not being condescending or not being, oh, poor you, but to really say, gee, I can understand how my action might have made you feel X, Y, Z. And again, therapists can help with some of that languaging of that communication style, but it's just really, I think it's consistently living with integrity is probably the best way. And as I say, sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes those marriages don't really heal, but more often than not, they do. But it takes time.
Yeah, and I think, there are little things you can do to show that you really do want to be in the relationship. David talked about keeping it light, keeping it easy. Hey, let's go pick a Christmas tree together. I'll drive, you pick the tree, or including your spouse or partner in activities that you enjoy, in activities that she or he enjoys, in activities that you don't, or that you hate, but your partner loves. Say, hey, do you want to do this? Make it clear you want to spend time together, and fun time together is a good way to start remembering, what brought you together in the first place, kind of dating again.
That's a really good point, Scott, is just to have fun. I think sometimes really a couple, and it sounds kind of awkward to have to consciously go out and have fun, but I think it's important to create new memories and new connections and to kind of revive. There's a great expression called limerence, right? Limerence is that state when you first fall in love with somebody and you're kind of just totally obsessed with them and you can't think of anything else. And all that's a newness of the relationship. But I think long-standing couples can do things like consciously having fun, doing stuff recreationally together that can really ignite that again. Interesting, there's a study in England, one of the greatest predictors of couples surviving together was to have them do some kind of joint thing, a joint task. So they would get like one of those horrible things from IKEA that, it's a full dining room set that's in a box, 6x6, and you're putting it together. And that was a great predictor, but all the skills involved in that, cooperating, collaborating, being considerate, asking for help, all those things go into this process. So, yeah.
And the holidays are a great opportunity for that, especially if you have kids, just make Christmas cookies as a family or something. Yeah. I mean, if you got a couple of little kids, you can't help but have fun. Okay, yeah. So we got this is a good holiday question here. On 12/20, this is somebody from our treatment center. On 12/21, I will go from treatment with seeking integrity to getting picked up at the airport in my hometown by my spouse, who I betrayed and lied to. And then the holidays with my family for a few days, then a few days with his family, before we finally reach our mutual home the day after Christmas. I realized you touched on this at the beginning, but what statements/scripts would be best to set boundaries to get through the holidays until we're back within our own home? And I would add, and even when you are back within your own home. But yeah.
Yeah, I mentioned at the beginning kind of managing expectations. And I think this is really something to kind of be laid out before you get into those situations, before you arrive at those homes. That's a tough itinerary that you just laid out, coming out of treatment and going to both families. And
I think some of it depends on what your family knows and what his family knows about where you've been for the last couple of weeks.
Yeah. I would apply those things I talked about before, which is really managing expectations, taking care of yourself, even if you're at your partner's house, really taking time to go out for a drive or a walk, or to not feel like you have to be engaged 24 hours, but to really take space for yourself. And I would have phone calls of the guys that you're in treatment with or people in your support group that you can call. And I would say in advance, schedule a call, just so you have ways of kind of maintaining your equilibrium in what can be a really powerfully kind of upsetting dynamic. But I think there's no easy answer. That's a hard thing, going to all those families and all the stress involved. Scott raised a really important point. What do they know? What don't they know? I think one of the things people do early on, out of shame or anxiety or what people are going to think, they kind of blurt out to everybody what they've just gone through with treatment, and they're a sex addict or porn addict. And I think I really recommend not doing that right away until we really think through who we're disclosing to. Yeah, as you know, disclosure to your spouse is a big formal process that does take time. So I'd just be cautious about that. Think all that through in advance. I think every situation possible, I'd hate for you to be on the spur of the moment and try to create a response, because these are powerfully emotional laden times and situations. So if possible, I would really limit the time. I guess it's already set to go to these different families, but I would really limit the time involved by planning things out with you and your partner, where you can go out and actually reconnect. If you've been in treatment, and you guys are going to be going through a getting acquainted phase as well. And so to really do all that at the same time is tricky. But I would really get your priorities straight, meaning taking care of yourself, and then taking care of your primary relationship, and then keeping the families happy, doing your duty, but being really as self-caring as you can, with meetings, with support, with managing those expectations.
Yeah, I would have, I would recommend having something scheduled every morning and something scheduled every evening or afternoon, and then something scheduled for before bed that is self-care just for you. Maybe a phone call to somebody you were in treatment with in the morning, and then in the afternoon, maybe you go to a meeting, or you log on to sexandrelationshiphealing.com and sit in on a webinar, even if you have to put in headphones and, to create some privacy. And then in the evening, check in either with your partner, just say, this is what went well today, this is what didn't go so well, this is what I struggled with, and then let your partner have the same kind of check-in. This went well, this I struggled with, just to give yourself some support. If you have a sponsor, a 12-step sponsor, by all means, you should be talking to your sponsor every day.
There's another technique that Scott just gave a great list of things called bookending, where if there's a meal that's going to be particularly stressful, or something where you have to, you're worried about or concerned about, bookending is simply having contact with somebody before and after, and just calling, okay, I'm about to sit down, with crazy Uncle Joe or whatever, and then calling the person afterwards saying, I got through it, everything's fine. But that somehow is a very helpful way to ground yourself in the middle of a stressful situation, just by having that contact.
Yeah, and as far as boundaries, I'm glad you're still at the center, because there's going to be some conversations with you and your spouse and a therapist and things like that, and maybe boundaries for the holidays should be discussed in that session, and a plan for this 5-day chunk of time. And if you've got a father-in-law who is obnoxious, maybe your partner can set some boundaries with his family. And if your mother drives your partner crazy, maybe you can set some boundaries with your family, and things like that. It's not so easy, though.
Right. And I would say also, just when someone goes out of treatment and kind of gets back together with their spouse, it's a hard time anyway. And so if you guys are immediately going to these other family scenarios, I would just kind of make a decision with your partner that you're not going to talk about anything heavy. You're just going to go through the motions socially, and not get into deep conversations while you're in the middle of all this travel with family. I would just put that on the shelf and do it as best you can without getting in.
There's nothing wrong with acting as if you're having a great holiday.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that at all.
Yeah. For sure.
So yeah. Thank you, everybody. We're quiet today. We want more questions next week. David, you want to take us out with a recap or any thoughts?
Yeah. So just quick things for dealing with holiday stress. Certainly avoiding substances, even if you're not an addict. Not over drinking, not overindulging, not overeating, not isolating. We want to make sure we're connected with healthy people that kind of have our backs and are there to support us. Basic self-care, getting adequate exercise, getting adequate sleep, eating well, not overeating, that kind of stuff. Angry, lonely, tired, all that stuff. Managing expectations about not having to be at 18,000 parties over the course of a couple days, or having to get a gift for everybody, or having to do this or having to do that. A lot of the holiday stress that we create ourselves by thinking we have to do this or have to do that. Just being realistic about that. And finally, just setting limits on social obligations. And this really has to do with managing our expectations too, on how much we spend, how much we eat, all that, just kind of being nice to ourselves in that regard.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We will be back next week, same time, same place. And we hope to see you then. The guys in LA, you will see me tomorrow.
Cool.
Yay. All right. So good night, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night, Scott.